Hello, Miami alumni and friends, and welcome to a special presentation. Miami presents Riding Shotgun and the American Road Trip with Dr. Andrew Offenburger. My name is JJ Slager, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement at Miami. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Miami professor and author, Dr. Andrew Offenburger, who has graciously offered to share his time mid-semester with us. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. We are also excited to have such a great audience today. As usual, faculty, staff, parents, friends, and alumni and students ranging from the classes of 1962 all the way to 2023. So a great group joining along. Thanks for being here with us. Also, thank you to those of you who submitted questions ahead of time. We also welcome participation live. You can share your comments or your questions using the Ask a Question link right below your video if you're watching on ALC. So please feel free to participate, and we'll probably get to most of those at the end. And let me go ahead and formally introduce Dr. Offenburger. Dr. Andrew Offenburger is an associate professor of history at Miami University, where he is a scholar of frontiers, borders, and American expansion. He is the author of Frontiers in the Gilded Age, published in 2019 by Yale University Press. And he recently edited the Aimless Life, just out with the University of Nebraska Press. And Dr. Offenburger is currently writing a history of the American road trip genre, which is what we're going to get a sneak peek of today. But his other books are linked down in the bio as well, if you'd like to check those out. So with that said, Andrew, please take it away.
Thanks so much for having me, JJ, into the Alumni Association. As was mentioned, I'm developing a book about this American road trip genre, from which I'll read some early writings and more informal writings for this audience. I'm here at Miami this semester. I'm teaching a course called Raiders of the Lost Archive, which uses the Indiana Jones films to explore what historians do and all about historical research. But a year ago, or actually 2 years ago now, it seems, just about, I taught American road trips as a class. So I used the classroom and my research as kind of symbiotic laboratories of sorts, or what Miami would call the teacher-scholar model. So I'll just get into this, and I'm happy to answer any questions either during as I'm presenting, and JJ, please just interrupt me, or at the end. So Highway 71, oh wait, let me get sharing here. JJ, can you put my screen up there?
Yeah. Can you still go into present mode, please?
Yes, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
All set.
Okay. Highway 71 north out of Storm Lake, Iowa might seem like a random place to have started a road trip. I don't disagree. But randomness can be a virtue. William Least Heatmoon excelled at finding America, at least his version of it, in more or less random places, along blue highways, roads that canvass the nation like a dense network of veins. So yes, random in the sense that most people haven't heard of Storm Lake or its Buena Vista County in northwestern Iowa. But Matt Norman and I, fellow road trippers and former college roommates, once called this place home at Buena Vista University. The university took the county name, formed in 1851, after the famous Battle of Buena Vista in the Mexican-American War. But as with Piru, Indiana, or Cairo, Illinois, Buena Vista acquired a Midwestern, shall we say, inflection when local politicians appropriated the Mexican place name. Matt and I would come to know each other well as ourselves on the adventure we took some 20 years ago, a journey spanning all lower 48 states from September 1999 to April 2000. Fresh out of college, we thought it was our place and time to document American culture at the turn of the century. Here my older self whispers, "How presumptuous." And here my younger self replies, Actually, I can't read that. There's lots of asterisks, but you get the message. So something about moving through space and time together for 8 months created an indelible bond. And here I'll say that this slide is proof that we started and ended the journey together. These photos were taken 8 months apart. So it created an indelible bond. 8 months together, traveling in the luxurious accommodations of a stick-shift hatchback Honda Civic. Oh, to be young, unattached, and free, with the tiny exception of a shoestring budget. And after 8 months of this roaming life, we would, in effect, come to have a new understanding of freedom. When one of us drove, the other, of course, rode shotgun. That's a curious phrase, inherited from the American Western past, when the man accompanying the stagecoach driver held a shotgun to protect travelers. In those purportedly wild and free days, violence was intimately paired with the open road. 39,000 miles we traveled, and we had to find ways to break up the monotony. Whenever filling up the gas tank, Matt and I would guess how many gallons were needed. The closest estimate won something trivial, but these fill-ups became sites of intense rivalry. In rural Utah, for example, one could have witnessed quite a scene by surveying the vast expanse near Salt Flats, heat waves rippling above the road, perhaps a vulture flying overhead, and why not? Let's add a tumbleweed rolling across the road. In this serene setting would be two idiots crouched near a fuel pump with hands in the air, bouncing and chanting, go, 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 and stop, 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 all for the simple pleasure of forcing one to buy, say, a candy bar for the other. The memories are warm. Nostalgia creeps into the past, rounding and shaping memories. But the past can be prickly. Matt and I haven't spoken for the last few years. How many of us have heard that call, felt its tug from beyond the horizon? That burning desire to go, to move, to get underway, any place, away from any here, John Steinbeck famously wrote. To move about, free and unanchored, not towards something, but away from something. Nearly every American hungers to move. The answer to that question, how many have felt this tug, is not exactly precise. A lot. A more focused question would be, how many of us have felt the need to document these experiences? The answer? Thousands of us. Browsing my bookshelf right here alone, we have walkabouts in the 19th century, a walk across America in the 20th, suffragettes, train rides, bus rides, a father and son recreating Oregon Trail migrations, baseball fans going to each park, a baseball fan playing catch with random strangers across the country, a traveler eating pie in each state, hippies looking for enlightenment, comedians providing social commentary, musicians on tour, philosophizing motorcyclists, inward explorers, hitchhikers, foreigners seeking to understand America, British, French, Russian, and more, and famous authors with one named fame writing up their trips in no particular order: Steinbeck, Kerouac, Miller, Fitzgerald, Moon, McMurtry, and so on. In the spring of 2020, I taught a class here at Miami called American Road Trips. Here you'll see one of my class's topics, which I displayed as road signs and giving students an estimate of what our time would be together that day. You might be happy to note that I conducted fill-up challenges and had students guess how many gallons my last fill-up needed, with the winner earning extra credit. And so I would announce this during class time with the following unexpected slide. Following this, I would show students my gas gauge before filling up, so they had an estimate on how much gas, or how many gallons would go in the tank. And then it would lead to the big moment when people would start wagering on how many gallons, and all of this for extra credit. Okay, so I tried to have a little fun with the road trips class. Sue me for it. We read many classic road trips books Yet we analyzed what made the genre and why. We were all fellow travelers that semester. Interrupted. Road closed, I announced. Online detour. Interrupted by COVID. At the end of the semester, I asked each student to pick from a list of works in the road trip genre. I hadn't read such books in the last 2 or 3 years before then, and decided to compile a list of newly published works. I easily found dozens, if not more than 100. The students did an excellent job of reading them and placing them within the tradition of what might be called the road trip genre. What was this genre, I can hear you all asking. In the words of my students, why did it become a thing? It's spring 2021 now. I'm driving alone from Ohio to Iowa, and the hum of tires on the highway is hypnotizing. Thoughts emerge from the landscape. They linger and recede like mileage signs. Thoughts of the road, naturally, of that trip so long ago with Matt, and of the life lived in between. Indianapolis, Champaign, Galesburg, and Peoria. While approaching the Mississippi and Western Illinois, rows of mature corn stalks whisk by, creating stasis from movement. Now employed as a professional historian, I'll get to that next slide in a second. Now employed as a professional historian, my thoughts drift briefly to the Sac Indian leader named Blackhawk, who in the 1830s fought nearby for a field like these, which had been so long the home of my fathers, he wrote, who now slept on the hills. I could not bring my mind to consent to leave this country to the whites for any earthly consideration. In the 1950s, Jack Kerouac also hurtled across these same plains. He described his fictionalized narrator's location as halfway across America, at the dividing line between the east of my youth and the west of my future. I think of how this region, once the far west, and the nation transformed from the land of Blackhawk in the 1830s to that of Kerouac's imagination 120 years later. The distance of a century between then and now blurs and then comes into focus, like 100 rows of corn along Interstate 80. Kerouac's quote on the east of the narrator's youth and the west of his future has all the undertones of a settler's view of the West. This was intentional, of course. He described his novel as one whose background is the recurrence of the pioneering instinct in American life and its expression of the migration of the present generation. The quote also establishes the road trip itself as a rite of passage between youth and adulthood, thereby replicating on a personal level the national past of migration and settler colonialism of what Western historians have described as growing up with the country. How did Kerouac's vision of the American road trip, or others' visions, become the norm? Why have shadow texts emerged, or unrecognized travel narratives, in the words of literary critic Chris Lackey? Why have they been left by the roadside, as it were? One might look at Blackhawks Memoir, published in the 1830s, as a road trip narrative equal to Kerouac's. Imprisoned, Blackhawk was taken to D.C. as a captive, and he was taken around the eastern U.S. by steamboat, stagecoach, and rail to meet President Jackson, to appear on stage to U.S. audiences, and later to ruminate on the implications of federal power, a diminished indigenous presence, and, pushed west, the receding graves of his mothers and fathers. From the perspective of a Western historian, Blackhawk's autobiography offered more insight into America than Kerouac's On the Road ever did. The exit for Rock Island, Illinois passed some time ago, Keokuk, Iowa, too. But do these two works by Blackhawk and Kerouac belong in the same genre? I believe so. The tradition of the American road trip genre is intertwined with the history of the American West. By reorienting the genre away from kitsch and towards the processes of Western history, new authors can join the conversation. This impulse guides my current research, which analyzes thousands of road trip books, manuscripts, memoirs, and their analyses by scholars to present a new understanding of the tradition. I define the genre as the meeting points of three contributing streams. One, a journey in what is today's United States, written by natives or newcomers, and including relevant foreign travelers. I do not eliminate text based on the modes of transportation. Number two, self-reflection. The traveler must ruminate on her or his encounters. This is more than mere exploration or reporting. So based on this criteria, Lewis and Clark would be out, but Ilf and Petrov, two Soviet authors traveling the States in the 1930s, would be in. And three, insight into larger socio-political positioning, or the urge, in the words of Simon and Garfunkel, to look for America. I have been including books and other select cultural productions, including some films, that meet these criteria. Of the texts consulted so far, the vast majority have been authored by white men, yes, though this trend has been challenged for longer than most people realize. Women on their own road trips in the 1910s, author John Williams, for example, touring the early 1960s, and his book, This Is My Country Too, reporting on being Black in America. And Erica Lopez's Flaming Iguanas from 1994, which takes direct aim at the hoary tradition and injects wonderfully blasphemous imagery and life into the genre, written by a proud bisexual woman of Puerto Rican descent. There have been limited fictional accounts of Native American road trips, notably authored by Sherman Alexie and David Seals. These lay bare the long routes of conquest that have shaped the road trip genre, which is discussed pretty ingeniously by Philip Deloria in his quite famous book, Indians in Unexpected Places. As Deloria explains, the national narrative crafted by succeeding generations of settler colonists separated Native Americans from technology. They were being pitched as something of the past rather than of the present and future. And so things like the sight of Geronimo in a Cadillac, or we could say like Black Hawk on Eastern Railroad lines, was therefore jarring to viewers then as they are now. Why the erasure of native journeys? Why is there humor and symbolism in Sherman Alexie's Smoke Signals, which describes his protagonist driving a car that only operates in reverse? There are structural, historical, and cultural reasons for this. So first, structural. The act of moving from point A to point B, from beginning to end, no matter how straight or circuitous the route is, naturally creates a division on each side of the journey's route. This has consequences, as Angela Hudson explains in her Creek Paths, Federal Roads. In the early 19th century, Creeks recognized the dangers of allowing federal roads to transect their lands. These facilitated the movement of traders and later squatters, settlers, families, and the military. Structurally, then, any journey reinscribes the power of the road. This has, more often than not, come at the expense of indigenous peoples. Historical. The urge to travel the United States and survey its wonders, to look for America, emerged in force from 19th century railroad campaigns to see America first, as my colleague Peggy Schaefer has shown. Advertisers implored middle and upper class Americans to vacation in their own country rather than in Europe, as was fashion. At the same time, the Good Roads movement opened the greater West to horseless carriages, and before long, a road memoir tradition emerged, made accessible recently by Peter Blodgett's dogged research in Motoring West, a compilation of early national road trips of the 20th century. Cultural reasons now, the third of three. Given these structural and historical forces, the genre developed in a cultural vacuum of sorts. It flourished among a class of mostly Anglo-Americans with enough means or wealth to be influenced by marketing campaigns, to see America first, and later to see the USA in a Chevrolet. But academics have begun to find notable alternate routes running alongside literary interstates. Gretchen Soren's Driving While Black, for example, analyzes how the open road was not synonymous with freedom for African Americans in the 20th century, much like a sack warrior in the 19th century. The recent film Green Book exemplified this troubled history. Many of you might have seen. Mobility and freedom were only linked for privileged travelers. Fields like these along Interstate 80 pass to the rhythm of road patches, a thoroughfare long and level. Blackhawk foresaw the flattening of American history when he said in his memoir, "It is astonishing what labor and pains the white people have had to make this road, which are generally covered with rocks and timber, yet it has been made smooth and easy to travel upon. And yet, no matter the facility of travel, of the tires hum on Interstate 80 or the melody of Route 66, no matter the hands or the machines that planted these fields outside the car window, the crops continue to return each cycle. The fields remain fertile. Stalks will emerge once again, cultivated by ancestral soil, a new harvest we work to collect each October." I'm going to end there, and thank you for listening. And I'm happy to just engage in a conversation and answer any questions that you all might have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. That was awesome. All right, we had a couple pre-submitted questions, and now's a good time for anyone else to join in the conversation. Please feel free to use the Ask a Question link below your video, and we will share those along, whether you want to anonymously pass them along or share your name. Either way, please join the conversation. And let's start with what came in ahead of time. You talked about this a little bit with your individual road trip that kind of got you started on this, but someone asked what got you interested in the topic. And so maybe it was that, but taking it a step further, what made you do that road trip? What were your feelings that led to that?
That's a very complex question. I mean, I can be trite and just answer it simply in that, how could you not want to take a road trip to, America? I remember feeling I was a year out from graduation, and my friend Matt was just graduating in 1999. And so I had already been in the professional world and had felt the open road calling a little bit. And just to, foster those interests, I started reading road trips themselves. And I wondered how might such a road trip might be different from the days of Steinbeck and Kerouac and Least Heat Moon in the 1980s and others. And so that's how the idea occurred to me that I'd like to go travel the road, but also document the travels while they were happening. So my friend and I kept a website while we were going that would post updates. It was a blog before blogs existed. I was that cool. But we would update it. And the main reason we did that was to not only document our, the people we were encountering and the places, but we used it to kind of actively recruit free places to stay, kind of couch surfing, as it were. And we would camp along the road. We would, along the way, we would meet others through the website and then meet them in person. And it did end up working to those ends, but it was really, and it came from an intellectual interest to place this within the longer trajectory. And I knew, pragmatically speaking, that my days without many attachments were going to be getting limited. After college, it's not long before you find yourself with a family and a job that you love. And I had not yet reached that promised land. And so decided now better than never. And so that's what led to the trip. And I asked my friend Matt, and it took all of like 5 seconds to rope him in for this. And I didn't mention this, by the way, but he was an acoustic guitarist and would play at coffee shops and bars along the way while I was a freelance writer. So, yeah.
Awesome.
That's a great question.
Well, are there any, I'm sure you saw an amazing amount of things, but are there any stories or memories from that trip that like stick out that really made an impact on you thinking about the bigger picture of the American road trip?
At the time, the answer is no. I was wanting to gain that experience first and foremost. And I had read lots of travelogues, but what I had not acquired was an appreciation for how the genre was really stilted towards white men that had done it before. And certainly I fit that pattern and was no exception. It wasn't until I became a historian of the American West that I began to see the deeper roots that this genre grew from. And so for a long time, I had intended on writing a book about our own travels. But, try as I might, I felt like I couldn't contribute anything new to that genre because here I was fitting the mold of the people that had done it beforehand. But after getting a PhD in Western history and understanding the deeper connections to the American past of expansion, I feel like I have something unique to contribute, and that's when I decided I'm gonna work this up. And the resulting book will be more about the history of the West and how it contributed to this genre. It will be less about my or Matt's own travels, but that will be perhaps a narrative device to get through the story as I've done here.
Yeah, all right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then what about just from a more like aesthetic standpoint, or like taking a trip across the country? Is there any place that maybe some of the audience wouldn't think of that was exceptionally beautiful, or like made an impact on you just from the landscape? Or
I mean, you can find that everywhere. That's the that's the easy way out to answer that question. But I had found southern Utah and northern Arizona to be exceptionally beautiful. Then you can always point to Highway 1 on the California coast that many people know pretty well. And our trip was timed pretty well in that we were in New England in fall. So those are the things that really jump out at me. But honestly, I look back at the pictures we took, and we did have a digital camera. So we were fortunate in that way. I look back at those pictures, and you can see beauty in northern Minnesota and kind of the gently rolling hills there. We took a bunch of pictures of like the car with the landscape behind it, or of ourselves, obviously. But the landscape did dominate that trip. And had we the time, or less of an urge to finish the trip within 8 months, I could have just ended up easily in California or Utah, Nevada. I mean, that's just really some beautiful territory out there. Yeah.
All right, awesome. This is hopefully another easy question, but Kelly was wondering, what is the tapestry or the banner behind you? If you could share the significance of your background?
That's a great question. I'm always looking at people's backgrounds as they're speaking. Yes. So I'm a historian of frontiers and borders, and my PhD was in American history, but my master's degree was in African history. So this tapestry is the story, let me move out of the way a little bit, of a famous incident in South African history called the Hosa cattle killing of 1856-57. Where there was a prophecy for the people that if they destroyed their crops and killed their cattle, kind of a slaughter or offering, that a new great nation would return from the sea and push European settlers back from whence they came. It's a really tragic event, but it's fascinating nonetheless. And it's what I looked into for my master's thesis. So the tapestry narrates that history in 3 general panels there.
Gotcha. All right. One other one that came in ahead of time, I don't know if you have any expertise on this, but someone asked about hitchhiking, and where has hitchhiking gone, or do you know anything about the history of that?
Well, I can. I'm blanking on the name of the book right now, but if they were to send me an email, I'd set them up with it. But I recently reviewed a book that's about hitchhiking throughout the 20th century. And it was really well done in that the mode of hitchhiking, today we kind of look at it, it's illegal or certainly looked down upon. If someone is doing it, you're a little nervous about security. And so it was, how did that come to be? And as many of our, shall we say, well, as many people would remember who are older alumni, hitchhiking didn't always used to be that way. And so this book looks at how that ebbed and flowed over time, depending on the current political climate. So hitchhiking in the 60s was much more accepted and open than it was in the late 70s and 80s. And the scholar convincingly linked it to overarching political climates at the time, and went into some archives to look at ways that it was seen as, in fact, a good thing to do or a natural thing to do earlier in the 20th century. If the person with that question emails me, I'll get them the title of the book. It's worth looking at.
All right, thank you. You may have kind of hit this already, but Bob Wood was hoping that you would sum up what was your main takeaway from your trip and look into America.
I gestured toward this a little bit in the talk. My main takeaway was that freedom is a relative term. The natural inclination to look at the open road and associate it with freedom. After 6, 7, or 8 months in a Honda Civic with the same person, doesn't seem so free anymore. And really settling down and getting a place to be for longer than a short period of time seems like a freer activity to do once you've been on the road for so long. So for me, apart from seeing America and seeing various peoples and places, it really reframed how I thought of freedom, and it made me realize that it was a relative term that needed some further study. And as you can tell in the example I give with Blackhawk, who is taken captive and more or less paraded around the Eastern coast and brought back to the Midwest, freedom and mobility are not always synonymous.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Got some more questions coming in. Keep them coming. Randy Hollowell says, Dr. Offenburger, I was in attendance on Tuesday at the screening of Storm Lake and loved it. So thank you for that. My question here is, what is so compelling about the Midwest and West from a road trip perspective as compared to, say, the Northeast or Deep South? As a native of Colorado, I get it, but I would like your perspective.
Well, I don't think it's, thank you for coming to Storm Lake. And you're probably the one person who understood me why I started where I did in the presentation. I don't think there's anything more insightful or exceptional about the Midwest. It just happens to be where I'm from. I'm from Iowa, and I went to undergrad at Buena Vista University. So it was a natural place for us to start and end our trips. But it is an interesting ongoing research question is that scholars have started to look at more systematically over the last 20 years is, what is the Midwest? What is its culture? It's oftentimes posited as a place lacking culture, or that is the norm for America. But just as freedom became unsettled for me in this trip, so should the idea of an American norm be interrogated a little bit more thoroughly. So the Midwest itself is not a more accurate or reflective mirror for American culture or America in general. I think you can find that anywhere else as likely as you are to find it here. But in summation, I would just say it's where I'm from. It's where we started our trip. But I'll add on to that and say it's been interesting to be over here in Ohio now, where we've lived the last 7 years, and to see the similarities and differences from what I knew growing up in Iowa. Thank you for that question. That's good.
All right. Erica Schaefer says, yes, the Pacific Coast Highway has been my best road trip to date. I plan to do Route 66 at some point. Any tips? I assume Route 66 was part of your journey and research.
Yeah, we hit it several times. We didn't travel the whole length of Route 66. But I would recommend reach out to me by email. I can send you a resource I have that looks at the indigenous history along Route 66 as well. So this is where I think scholars have done some good work, and some native peoples too, in getting beyond the kitsch of Route 66. So looking at the actual history, if you reach out to me, I'll send you a really nice summary pamphlet of sorts that I found online a while back that will give you some of that deeper and indigenous history that I think you'd find really insightful as you're traveling.
All right. Thank you. Let's see here. I put your email up there since you've offered
Great.
Let people reach out to you if people want to get that down. All right. Keep them coming. We have a few more in. This is from Jennifer. How do you develop your courses? From the road trip class a couple years ago to the Raiders of the Lost Archives this year. My daughter is in the Raiders class and really enjoys it. I'm curious as to your inspiration to curate these interesting classes.
Good question. There doesn't seem to be a common thread there, but there is. So most of my courses emanate in some way from my research. So for the Raiders class, the book that I had published in 2019 looked at U.S. expansion into Mexico and at how railroad companies and other capitalist enterprises viewed Mexico as a place for development there. And there were some ties to development and some people that were in the same regions as there was in development in Southern Africa. So to put it simply, a lot of people saw these venues as places of expansion and where you can extract wealth. So what this did was I realized before long in my research that I was starting to find a lot of characters that were like Indiana Jones in my research, that they wanted to go in, grab the wealth and get out. And, you know, even though it belonged in a museum, they were still taking the wealth out of the country of origin. So it started from my research, and I thought, what a fun way that would be to get students to start to think about historical research a little bit differently using the Indiana Jones films, and to expose them to different historians and their methods and their sources. So that's how that came about. And the road trips class is also kind of another seemingly fun and why wouldn't I take that class type of thing. But as you saw from my presentation, it does come from my interest in Western history. And that's where I originally stumbled upon the idea of developing this more rigorously. So I try to take my research, find some way that students can more easily or connect to it in a fun way, and reframe how students think of history. You know, it's not all battles, it's not all munitions or battalions. It's a lot of fun, culturally significant things can be studied rigorously in the past. So thank you for that question. I'm loving teaching the Raiders class, and I hope all the students are as well. I know I am.
Well, it seems like at least one is, according to her
That's
mother.
right, yeah.
That's awesome. All right, Steve asks, Blue Highways or River Horse? Another great Least Heat Moon book. Another
Yes.
good one is Rinker Buck's 2015 book, The Oregon Trail. Can you comment on any of those?
Yeah, that's the Oregon Trail one was one I had in mind as I was writing this. Here I have to confess, I've read William Least Heat Moon's Blue Highways. River Horse I have yet to get through. I haven't started it. But he does have an interesting recent work out called Oh America that's more historical in nature. So right now I just have to say Blue Highways, but stay posted for that. Check my book when it comes out down the road, as it were, and perhaps I can be convinced otherwise. I have reached out to William Least Heat Moon to see if he would talk to me, because he's descended from indigenous peoples, the Osage, and he might have some insight into some of the themes that I explore in this writing here that I look forward to speaking with him soon about.
Awesome. All right. David Loy says, my primary experience from a road trip from Kentucky to Oregon in the late 70s was the transition from the domination of nature in the East and Midwest to the grandeur and dominance of nature in the West. It contributed to an emergent ecological consciousness. Any thoughts?
Totally agree. Yeah, completely agree. There, you have to be careful when you think about that too, though, just because there is environmental, what you're describing as environmental dominance doesn't mean that there are rural and environmental and agriculturally significant enterprises that are happening east of Ohio. But they happen to be on a much smaller scale, obviously. But yes, I totally agree. And another interesting point about this, perhaps that complicates that binary that's off the top of my head seems very well set up, is if you look at the Midwest these days and you go out there, and in my narrative, I gesture towards the cornfields and the rows and how they kind of create a blur. You tend to see nature or the environment or crops or agriculture, but really what you're seeing is industrial enterprise, industrial agriculture, and enterprise on a grand scale. You do see a domination of agriculture of the land in the Midwest, as far west as Nebraska, 100th meridian territory. So I'd be careful in applying that to the Midwest. Perhaps one could say the 100th meridian is where that binary folds. And but beyond west of there, I would tend to agree, especially as to the environmental consciousness that results from it.
Interesting. All right. Barbie Schaefer.
Great question, by the way. I meant to have that.
Barbie Schaefer says, as a recent widow, my great American retirement road trip will be solo. Have you ever completed a solo trip? And if so, any tips?
Well, recently I completed a couple of solo shorter road trips of just going to visit family between Ohio and Iowa. It's 9.5 hours.
A lot of corn on that one.
Yeah, a lot of corn and lots of time solo. If you ask me a question whether I'd be alone in a car all day or with someone for 8 months, that's kind of a tough question to answer. But there is something, I open this piece with referencing the meditative nature of the road. And so I do find that when I'm driving 9.5 hours to Iowa, it goes by pretty quickly because I just start thinking about things and your mind wanders, much as how I described it here. So there is a space for the great solo trip. I would encourage you to do that. There's nothing, in fact, it's in ways, it's even more liberating to do that than if you have a husband or a friend that's going along with you. I'm trying to remember the recent film. Was it called Wanderlust? Or it describes a similar situation. Maybe she can chime in there in the chat. That if you have not seen it, you absolutely must. I think it'd be helpful and a way of kind of understanding the solo journey. So I hope that's helpful.
All right, thank you. And we have Doug wondering about, have you thought about how the American road trip and the genre would be different had the United States not focused so much on automobile travel? Like if we were crisscrossing the country in trains, would this still be a similar theme? Or have you thought about how that would be different?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it just makes me think that there's a similar type of tradition for high school students to take a year off. And what do? They go backpacking throughout Europe. They refer to it as backpacking. And that's because trains are much more developed. The systems and the networks are connected and developed in much more systematic ways than our train system here in the United States. Part of that is geographical, just in terms of the expanse. But that is, that's something I'll have to think some more about. Would this genre have emerged in the same way were it backpacking in the United States on trains rather than dealing with? There is something unique, even though my study does not limit itself to the automobile, because I want to view these a little more expansively. There is something unique I recognize to those texts that emerge from automobile travel and from car culture. That's a really good question.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that covers it. Thank you for the presentation and taking all the questions. What a good presentation. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for the good questions and for sharing your time. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
I did.
As much as I did. If you, like I mentioned before, if you want to see more of Andrew's work, there's a couple links for the books. If you help me remember, once your new book comes out on this topic, I'll email the people on this list to a link to that as well. Also like to make sure that you can see other upcoming events on the same ALC website. One past event you might want to take a look at, somewhat related to this, is another Miami history professor did an Objects That Changed the World presentation last spring on the Model T. And so some similar themes emerged from Steve Kahn in that presentation. If you go to past events on this page and just search Model T on that page, you'll find it. I think it was in March or April. And one other event I want to point out for next week, we're doing a special event, Miami at the Merc, Whose City, Whose Streets, where a panel of Miamians will discuss urban and regional planning trends, talking more about what's happening in the streets, what happens in the cities, and some transportation in that as well. That will be in person in Cincinnati, but those of you that aren't in Southwest Ohio, you can also watch it on this webinar platform, as we'll be live streaming as well. Yes.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
I had to Google this. I couldn't resist. The film that I recommended for that person that wrote in is not Wanderlust, it's Nomadland. And I'm sure she might be familiar with it, but definitely see that.
Okay, yeah, Nomadland.
Thank you.
Remember that. Okay, thanks for adding that in. Yeah, so I think that's it. Any other last words, Andrew, before we sign off?
No, just thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to discuss this further if anyone wants to get in touch. If for nothing else, then just to swap some stories.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for watching. Thank you, Andrew, very much for your time. Everyone, have a great day, and love and honor.
Thank you.